Chapter 1. My name is Mary Catherine Blackwood. I am 18 years old, and I live with my sister Constance. I have often thought that with any luck at all I could have been born a werewolf, because the two middle fingers on both my hands are the same length, but I have had to be content with what I had. I dislike washing myself, and dogs, and noise. I like my sister Constance, and Richard Plantagenet, and Amanita phalloides, the death cup mushroom. Everyone else in my family is dead. The last time I glanced at the library books on the kitchen shelf, they were more than 5 months overdue, and I wondered whether I would have chosen differently if I had known that these were the last books, the ones which would stand forever on our kitchen shelf. We rarely moved things. The Blackwoods were never much of a family for restlessness and stirring. We dealt with the small surface transient objects, the books and the flowers and the spoons, but underneath we had always a solid foundation of stable possessions. We always put things back where they belonged. We dusted and swept under tables and chairs and beds and pictures and rugs and lamps, but we left them where they were. The tortoiseshell toilet set on our mother's dressing table was never off place by so much as a fraction of an inch. Blackwoods had always lived in our house, and kept their things in order. As soon as a new Blackwood wife moved in, a place was found for her belongings, and so our house was built up with layers of Blackwood property weighting it, and keeping it steady against the world. It was on a Friday in late April that I brought the library books into our house. Fridays and Tuesdays were terrible days, because I had to go into the village. Someone had to go to the library, and the grocery. Constance never went past her own garden, and Uncle Julian could not. Therefore, it was not pride that took me into the village twice a week, or even stubbornness, but only the simple need for books and food. It may have been pride that brought me into Stellas for a cup of coffee before I started home. I told myself it was pride and would not avoid going into Stellas no matter how much I wanted to be at home, but I knew, too, that Stella would see me pass if I did not go in, and perhaps think I was afraid, and that thought I could not endure. "Good morning, Mary Catherine," Stella always said, reaching over to wipe the counter with a damp rag. "How are you today?" "Very well, thank you." "And Constance Blackwood, is she well?" "Very well, thank you." "And how is he?" "As well as can be expected." "Black coffee, please." If anyone else came in and sat down at the counter, I would leave my coffee without seeming hurried, and leave, nodding goodbye to Stella. "Keep well," she always said automatically as I went out. I chose the library books with care. There were books in our house, of course. Our father's study had books covering 2 walls, but I liked fairy tales and books of history, and Constance liked books about food. Although Uncle Julian never took up a book, he liked to see Constance reading in the evenings while he worked at his papers, and sometimes he turned his head to look at her and nod. "What are you reading, my dear?" "A pretty sight, a lady with a book." "I'm reading something called The Art of Cooking, Uncle Julian." "Admirable." We never sat quietly for long, of course, with Uncle Julian in the room, but I do not recall that Constance and I have ever opened the library books, which are still on our kitchen shelf. It was a fine April morning when I came out of the library. The sun was shining, and the false glorious promises of spring were everywhere, showing oddly through the village grime. I remember that I stood on the library steps holding my books and looking for a minute at the soft-tinted green in the branches against the sky and wishing, as I always did, that I could walk home across the sky instead of through the village. From the library steps I could cross the street directly and walk on the other side along to the grocery, but that meant that I must pass the general store and the men sitting in front. In this village, the men stayed young and did the gossiping, and the women aged with grey evil weariness and stood silently waiting for the men to get up and come home. I could leave the library and walk up the street on this side until I was opposite the grocery and then cross. That was preferable, although it took me past the post office and the Rochester house with the piles of rusted tin and the broken automobiles and the empty gas tins and the old mattresses and plumbing fixtures and wash tubs that the Harler family brought home and, I genuinely believe, loved. The Rochester house was the loveliest in town and had once had a walnut-paneled library and a second-floor ballroom and a profusion of roses along the veranda. Our mother had been born there, and by rights it should have belonged to Constance. I decided as I always did that it would be safer to go past the post office and the Rochester house, although I disliked seeing the house where our mother was born. This side of the street was generally deserted in the morning, since it was shady, and after I went into the grocery, I would, in any case, have to pass the general store to get home, and passing it going and coming was more than I could bear. Outside the village, on Hill Road and River Road and Old Mountain, people like the Clarks and the Carringtons had built new lovely homes. They had to come through the village to get to Hill Road and River Road because the main street of the village was also the main highway across the state, but the Clark children and the Carrington boys went to private schools and the food in the Hill Road kitchens came from the towns and the city. Mail was taken from the village post office by car along the River Road and up to Old Mountain, but the mountain people mailed their letters in the towns and the River Road people had their hair cut in the city. I was always puzzled that the people of the village, living in their dirty little houses on the main highway or out on Creek Road, smiled and nodded and waved when the Clarks and the Carringtons drove by. If Helen Clark came into Albert's grocery to pick up a can of tomato sauce or a pound of coffee her cook had forgotten, everyone told her good morning, and said the weather was better today. The Clarks' house is newer, but no finer than the Blackwood house. Our father brought home the first piano ever seen in the village. The Carringtons own the paper mill, but the Blackwoods own all the land between the highway and the river. The shepherds of Old Mountain gave the village its town hall, which is white and peaked and set in a green lawn with a cannon in front. There was some talk once of putting in zoning laws in the village and tearing down the shacks on Creek Road and building up the whole village to match the town hall, but no one ever lifted a finger. Maybe they thought the Blackwoods might take to attending town meetings if they did. The villagers get their hunting and fishing licenses in the town hall, and once a year, the Clarks and the Carringtons and the Shepherds attend town meeting and solemnly vote to get the Harler junkyard off Main Street and take away the benches in front of the general store, and each year the villagers gleefully outvote them. Past the town hall, bearing to the left, is Blackwood Road, which is the way home. Blackwood Road goes in a great circle around the Blackwood land, and along every inch of Blackwood Road is a wire fence built by our father. Not far past the town hall is the big black rock, which marks the entrance to the path where I unlock the gate and lock it behind me and go through the woods and am home. The people of the village have always hated us. I played a game when I did the shopping. I thought about the children's games where the board is marked into little spaces and each player moves according to a throw of the dice. There were always dangers, like lose one turn and go back 4 spaces and return to start, and little helps, like advance 3 spaces and take an extra turn. The library was my start and the black rock was my goal. I had to move down one side of Main Street, cross, and then move up the other side until I reached the black rock, when I would win. I began well, with a good safe turn along the empty side of Main Street, and perhaps this would turn out to be one of the very good days. It was like that sometimes, but not often on spring mornings. If it was a very good day, I would later make an offering of jewelry out of gratitude. I walked quickly when I started, taking a deep breath to go on with and not looking around. I had the library books and my shopping bag to carry, and I watched my feet moving one after the other, 2 feet in our mother's old brown shoes. I felt someone watching me from inside the post office. We did not accept mail, and we did not have a telephone. Both had become unbearable 6 years before, but I could bear a quick stare from the office. That was old Miss Dutton, who never did her staring out in the open like other folks, but only looked out between blinds or from behind curtains. I never looked at the Rochester house. I could not bear to think of our mother being born there. I wondered sometimes if the Harlow people knew that they lived in a house which should have belonged to Constance. There was always so much noise of crashing tinware in their yard that they could not hear me walking. Perhaps the Harlers thought that the unending noise drove away demons, or perhaps they were musical and found it agreeable. Perhaps the Harlers lived inside the way they did outside, sitting in old bathtubs and eating their dinner off broken plates set on the skeleton of an old Ford car, rattling cans as they ate, and talking in bellows. A spray of dirt always lay across the sidewalk where the Harlers lived. Crossing the street, lose one turn, came next, to get to the grocery, directly opposite. I always hesitated, vulnerable and exposed, on the side of the road, while the traffic went by. Most Main Street traffic was going through, cars and trucks passing through the village because the highway did, so the drivers hardly glanced at me. I could tell a local car by the quick ugly glance from the driver, and I wondered, always, what would happen if I stepped down from the curb onto the road. Would there be a quick, almost unintended swerve toward me? Just to scare me, perhaps, just to see me jump? And then the laughter, coming from all sides, from behind the blinds in the post office, from the men in front of the general store, from the women peering out of the grocery doorway, all of them watching and gloating, to see Mary Catherine Blackwood scurrying out of the way of a car. I sometimes lost 2 or even 3 turns, because I waited so carefully for the road to clear in both directions before I crossed. In the middle of the street I came out of the shade and into the bright, misleading sunshine of April. By July the surface of the road would be soft in the heat and my feet would stick, making the crossing more perilous. Merricat Blackwood, her foot caught in the tar, cringing as a car bore down on her, go back, all the way, and start over, and the buildings would be uglier. All of the village was of a piece, a time, and a style. It was as though the people needed the ugliness of the village, and fed on it. The houses and the stores seemed to have been set up in contemptuous haste to provide shelter for the drab and the unpleasant, and the Rochester house and the Blackwood house and even the town hall had been brought here perhaps accidentally from some far lovely country where people lived with grace. Perhaps the fine houses had been captured, perhaps as punishment for the Rochesters and the Blackwoods and their secret bad hearts, and were held prisoner in the village. Perhaps their slow rot was a sign of the ugliness of the villagers. The row of stores along Main Street was unchangingly gray. The people who owned the stores lived above them, in a row of second-story apartments, and the curtains in the regular line of second-story windows were pale and without life. Whatever planned to be colorful lost its heart quickly in the village. The blight on the village never came from the Blackwoods. The villagers belonged here, and the village was the only proper place for them. I always thought about rot when I came toward the row of stores. I thought about burning black painful rot that ate away from inside, hurting dreadfully. I wished it on the village. I had a shopping list for the grocery. Constance made it out for me every Tuesday and Friday before I left home. The people of the village disliked the fact that we always had plenty of money to pay for whatever we wanted. We had taken our money out of the bank, of course, and I knew they talked about the money hidden in our house, as though it were great heaps of golden coins, and Constance and Uncle Julian and I sat in the evenings, our library books forgotten, and played with it, running our hands through it and counting and stacking and tumbling it, jeering and mocking behind locked doors. I imagined that there were plenty of rotting hearts in the village coveting our heaps of golden coins, but they were cowards and they were afraid of Blackwoods. When I took my grocery list out of my shopping bag, I took out the purse too, so that Albert in the grocery would know that I had brought money and he could not refuse to sell to me. It never mattered who was in the grocery. I was always served at once. Mr. Albert or his pale greedy wife always came right away from wherever they were in the store to get me what I wanted. Sometimes, if their older boy was helping out in school vacation, they hurried to make sure that he was not the one who waited on me, and once when a little girl, a child strange to the village, of course, came close to me in the grocery, Mrs. Albert pulled her back so roughly that she screamed, and then there was a long still minute while everyone waited before Mrs. Albert took a breath and said, "Anything else?" I always stood perfectly straight and stiff when the children came close, because I was afraid of them. I was afraid that they might touch me and the mothers would come at me like a flock of taloned hawks. That was always the picture I had in my mind, birds descending, striking, gashing with razor claws. Today I had a great many things to buy for Constance, and it was a relief to see that there were no children in the store and not many women. Take an extra turn, I thought, and said to Mr. Albert, "Good morning." He nodded to me. He could not go entirely without greeting me, and yet the women in the store were watching. I turned my back to them, but I could feel them standing behind me, holding a can or a half-filled bag of cookies or a head of lettuce, not willing to move until I had gone out through the door again and the wave of talk began and they were swept back into their own lives. Mrs. Donnell was back there somewhere. I had seen her as I came in, and I wondered as I had before if she came on purpose when she knew I was coming, because she always tried to say something. She was one of the few who spoke. "A roasting chicken," I said to Mr. Albert, and across the store his greedy wife opened the refrigerated case and took out a chicken and began to wrap it. "A small leg of lamb," I said. "My Uncle Julian always fancies a roasted lamb in the first spring days." I should not have said it, I knew, and a little gasp went around the store, like a scream. I could make them run like rabbits, I thought, if I said to them what I really wanted to, but they would only gather again outside and watch for me there. "Onions," I said politely to Mr. Albert, "coffee, bread, flour." "Walnuts," I said, "and sugar. We are very low on sugar." Somewhere behind me there was a little horrified laugh, and Mr. Albert glanced past me, briefly, and then to the items he was arranging on the counter. In a minute Mrs. Albert would bring my chicken and my meat, wrapped, and set them down by the other things. I need not turn around until I was ready to go. "2 quarts of milk," I said. "A half pint of cream, a pound of butter." The Harises had stopped delivering dairy goods to us 6 years ago, and I brought milk and butter home from the grocery now. And a dozen eggs. Constance had forgotten to put eggs on the list, but there had been only 2 at home. A box of peanut brittle, I said. Uncle Julian would clatter and crunch over his papers tonight, and go to bed sticky. The Blackwoods always did set a fine table. That was Mrs. Donnell, speaking clearly from somewhere behind me, and someone giggled and someone else said SHH. I never turned. It was enough to feel them all there in back of me without looking into their flat gray faces, with the hating eyes. I wish you were all dead, I thought, and longed to say it out loud. Constance said, never let them see that you care, and if you pay any attention they'll only get worse, and probably it was true, but I wished they were dead. I would have liked to come into the grocery some morning and see them all, even the Alberts and the children, lying there crying with the pain and dying. I would then help myself to groceries, I thought, stepping over their bodies, taking whatever I fancied from the shelves, and go home, with perhaps a kick for Mrs. Donnell while she lay there. I was never sorry when I had thoughts like this, I only wished they would come true. It's wrong to hate them, Constance said, it only weakens you, but I hated them anyway, and wondered why it had been worth while creating them in the first place. Mr. Albert put all my groceries together on the counter and waited, looking past me into the distance. That's all I want today, I told him, and without looking at me he wrote the prices on a slip and added, then passed the slip to me so I could make sure he had not cheated me. I always made a point of checking his figures carefully, although he never made a mistake. There were not many things I could do to get back at them, but I did what I could. The groceries filled my shopping bag and another bag besides, but there was no way of getting them home except by carrying them. No one would ever offer to help me, of course, even if I would let them. Lose 2 turns. With my library books and my groceries, going slowly, I had to walk down the sidewalk past the general store and into Stellas. I stopped in the doorway of the grocery, feeling around inside myself for some thought to make me safe. Behind me the little stirrings and coughings began. They were getting ready to talk again, and across the width of the store the Alberts were probably rolling their eyes at each other in relief. I froze my face hard. Today I was going to think about taking our lunch out into the garden, and while I kept my eyes open just enough to see where I was walking, our mother's brown shoes going up and down, in my mind I was setting the table with a green cloth and bringing out yellow dishes and strawberries in a white bowl. Yellow dishes, I thought, feeling the eyes of the men looking at me as I went by, and Uncle Julian shall have a nice soft egg with toast broken into it, and I will remember to ask Constance to put a shawl across his shoulders because it is still very early spring. Without looking, I could see the grinning and the gesturing. I wished they were all dead and I was walking on their bodies. They rarely spoke directly to me, but only to each other. That's one of the Blackwood girls, I heard one of them say in a high mocking voice, one of the Blackwood girls from Blackwood Farm. Too bad about the Blackwoods, someone else said, just loud enough, too bad about those poor girls. Nice farm out there, they said, nice land to farm. Man could get rich, farming the Blackwood land. If he had 1,000,000 years and 3 heads, and didn't care what grew, a man could get rich. Keep their land pretty well locked up, the Blackwoods do. Man could get rich. Too bad about the Blackwood girls. Never can tell what'll grow on Blackwood land. I am walking on their bodies, I thought, we are having lunch in the garden and Uncle Julian is wearing his shawl. I always held my groceries carefully along here, because one terrible morning I had dropped the shopping bag and the eggs broke and the milk spilled and I gathered up what I could while they shouted, telling myself that whatever I did I would not run away, shoveling cans and boxes and spilled sugar wildly back into the shopping bag, telling myself not to run away. In front of Stellas, there was a crack in the sidewalk that looked like a finger pointing. The crack had always been there. Other landmarks, like the handprint Johnny Harris made in the concrete foundation of the town hall and the Mueller boys' initials on the library porch, had been put in times that I remembered. I was in the 3rd grade at the school when the town hall was built. But the crack in the sidewalk in front of Stellas had always been there, just as Stellas had always been there. I remember roller skating across the crack, and being careful not to step on it or it would break our mother's back, and riding a bicycle past here with my hair flying behind. The villagers had not openly disliked us then, although our father said they were trash. Our mother told me once that the crack was here when she was a girl in the Rochester house, so it must have been here when she married our father and went to live on Blackwood farm, and I suppose the crack was there, like a finger pointing, from the time when the village was first put together out of old grey wood, and the ugly people with their evil faces were brought from some impossible place and set down in the houses to live. Stella bought the coffee urn and put in the marble counter with the insurance money when her husband died, but otherwise there had been no change in Stellas since I could remember. Constance and I had come in here to spend pennies after school, and every afternoon we picked up the newspaper to take home for our father to read in the evening. We no longer bought newspapers, but Stella still sold them, along with magazines and penny candy and grey postcards of the town hall. "Good morning, Mary Catherine," Stella said when I sat down at the counter and put my groceries on the floor. I sometimes thought when I wished all the village people dead that I might spare Stella because she was the closest to kind that any of them could be, and the only one who managed to keep hold of any color at all. She was round and pink, and when she put on a bright print dress it stayed looking bright for a little while, before it merged into the dirty gray of the rest. "How are you today?" she asked. "Very well, thank you." "And Constance Blackwood, is she well?" "Very well, thank you." "And how is he?" "As well as can be expected." "Black coffee, please." I really preferred sugar and cream in my coffee, because it is such bitter stuff, but since I only came here out of pride, I needed to accept only the barest minimum for token. If anyone came into Stella's while I was there, I got up and left quietly, but some days I had bad luck. This morning, she had only set my coffee down on the counter when there was a shadow against the doorway, and Stella looked up and said, "Good morning, Jim." She went down to the other end of the counter and waited, expecting him to sit down there so I could leave without being noticed, but it was Jim Donnell, and I knew at once that today I had bad luck. Some of the people in the village had real faces that I knew and could hate individually. Jim Donnell and his wife were among these, because they were deliberate instead of just hating dully and from habit like the others. Most people would have stayed down at the end of the counter where Stella waited, but Jim Donnell came right to the end where I was sitting and took the stool next to me, as close to me as he could come because, I knew, he wanted this morning to be bad luck for me. "They tell me," he said, swinging to sit sideways on his stool and look at me directly, "they tell me you're moving away." I wished he would not sit so close to me. Stella came toward us on the inside of the counter, and I wished she would ask him to move so I could get up and leave without having to struggle around him. "They tell me you're moving away," he said solemnly. "No," I said, because he was waiting. "Funny," he said, looking from me to Stella and then back. "I could have swore someone told me you'd be going soon." "No," I said. "Coffee, Jim?" Stella asked. "Who do you think would have started a story like that, Stella? Who do you think would want to tell me they're moving away when they're not doing any such thing?" Stella shook her head at him, but she was trying not to smile. I saw that my hands were tearing at the paper napkin in my lap, ripping off a little corner, and I forced my hands to be still and made a rule for myself. Whenever I saw a tiny scrap of paper, I was to remember to be kinder to Uncle Julian. "Can't ever tell how gossip gets around," Jim Donnell said. Perhaps someday soon Jim Donnell would die. Perhaps there was already a rot growing inside him that was going to kill him. "Did you ever hear anything like the gossip in this town?" he asked Stella. "Leave her alone, Jim," Stella said. Uncle Julian was an old man, and he was dying regrettably, more surely than Jim Donnell and Stella and anyone else. The poor old Uncle Julian was dying, and I made a firm rule to be kinder to him. We would have a picnic lunch on the lawn. Constance would bring his shawl and put it over his shoulders, and I would lie on the grass. "I'm not bothering anybody, Stell." "Am I bothering anybody?" "I'm just asking Miss Mary Catherine Blackwood here how it happens everyone in town is saying she and her big sister are going to be leaving us soon. Moving away. Going somewhere else to live." He stirred his coffee. From the corner of my eye I could see the spoon going around and around and around, and I wanted to laugh. There was something so simple and silly about the spoon going around while Jim Donnell talked. I wondered if he would stop talking if I reached out and took hold of the spoon. Very likely he would, I told myself wisely. Very likely he would throw the coffee in my face. "Going somewhere else," he said sadly. "Cut it out," Stella said. I would listen more carefully when Uncle Julian told his story. I was already bringing peanut brittle, that was good. Here I was all upset, Jim Donnell said, thinking the town would be losing one of its fine old families. That would be really too bad. He swung the other way around on the stool, because someone else was coming through the doorway. I was looking at my hands in my lap and of course would not turn around to see who was coming, but then Jim Donnell said, "Joe," and I knew it was Dunham, the carpenter. "Joe, you ever hear anything like this? Here all over town they're saying that the Blackwoods are moving away, and now Miss Mary Catherine Blackwood sits right here and speaks up and tells me they're not." There was a little silence. I knew that Dunham was scowling, looking at Jim Donnell and at Stella and at me, thinking over what he had heard, sorting out the words and deciding what each one meant. "That's so," he said at last. "Listen, you two," Stella said, but Jim Donnell went right on, talking with his back to me, and his legs stretched out so I could not get past him and outside. "I was saying to people only this morning, it's too bad when the old families go. Although you could rightly say a good number of the Blackwoods are gone already." He laughed, and slapped the counter with his hand. "Gone already," he said again. The spoon in his cup was still, but he was talking on. "A village loses a lot of style when the fine old people go. Anyone would think," he said slowly, "that they wasn't wanted." "That's right," Dunham said, and he laughed. "The way they live up in their fine old private estate, with their fences and their private path and their stylish way of living." He always went on until he was tired. When Jim Donnell thought of something to say he said it as often and in as many ways as possible, perhaps because he had very few ideas and had to wring each one dry. Besides, each time he repeated himself he thought it was funnier. I knew he might go on like this until he was really sure that no one was listening anymore, and I made a rule for myself, never think anything more than once, and I put my hands quietly in my lap. "I am living on the moon," I told myself. "I have a little house all by myself on the moon." "Well," Jim Donnell said, he smiled, too. "I can always tell people I used to know the Blackwoods. They never did anything to me that I can remember, always perfectly polite to me. Not," he said, and laughed, "that I ever got invited to take my dinner with them, nothing like that." "That's enough right there," Stella said, and her voice was sharp. "You go pick on someone else, Jim Donnell." "Was I picking on anyone? You think I wanted to be asked to dinner? You think I'm crazy?" "Me," Dunham said, "I can always tell people I fixed their broken step once and never got paid for it." That was true. Constance had sent me out to tell him that we wouldn't pay carpenter's prices for a raw board nailed crookedly across the step, when what he was supposed to do was build it trim and new. When I went out and told him we wouldn't pay, he grinned at me and spat, and picked up his hammer and pried the board loose and threw it on the ground. "Do it yourself," he said to me, and got into his truck and drove away. "Never did get paid for it," he said now. "That must have been an oversight, Joe. You just go right up and speak to Miss Constance Blackwood and she'll see you get what's coming to you. Just if you get invited to dinner, Joe, you just be sure and say no thank you to Miss Blackwood." Dunham laughed. "Not me," he said. "I fixed their step for them and never did get paid for it." "Funny," Jim Donnell said, "them getting the house fixed up and all, and planning to move away all the time." "Mary Catherine," Stella said, coming down inside the counter, to where I was sitting, "you go along home. Just get up off that stool and go along home. There won't be any peace around here until you go." "Now, that's the truth," Jim Donnell said. Stella looked at him, and he moved his legs and let me pass. "You just say the word, Miss Mary Catherine, and we'll all come out and help you pack. Just you say the word, Merricat. And you can tell your sister for me," Dunham started to say, but I hurried, and by the time I got outside all I could hear was the laughter, the two of them and Stella. I liked my house on the moon, and I put a fireplace in it and a garden outside. What would flourish, growing on the moon? I must ask Constance, and I was going to have lunch outside in my garden on the moon. Things on the moon were very bright, and odd colors. My little house would be blue. I watched my small brown feet go in and out, and let the shopping bag swing a little by my side. I had been to Stellas, and now I needed only to pass the town hall, which would be empty except for the people who made out dog licenses, and the people who counted traffic fines from the drivers who followed the highway into the village and on through, and the people who sent out notices about water and sewage and garbage and forbade other people to burn leaves or to fish. These would all be buried. Somewhere deep inside the town hall, working busily together, I had nothing to fear from them unless I fished out of season. I thought of catching scarlet fish in the rivers on the moon and saw that the Harris boys were in their front yard, clamoring and quarreling with half a dozen other boys. I had not been able to see them until I came past the corner by the town hall, and I could still have turned back and gone the other way, up the main highway to the creek, and then across the creek and home along the other half of the path to our house, but it was late, and I had the groceries, and the creek was nasty to wade in our mother's brown shoes, and I thought, I am living on the moon, and I walked quickly. They saw me at once, and I thought of them rotting away and curling in pain and crying out loud. I wanted them doubled up and crying on the ground in front of me. Merricat, they called, Merricat, Merricat, and moved all together to stand in a line by the fence. I wondered if their parents taught them, Jim Donnell and Dunham and Dirty Harris leading regular drills of their children, teaching them with loving care, making sure they pitched their voices right. How else could so many children learn so thoroughly? Merricat, said Connie, would you like a cup of tea? Oh no, said Merricat, you'll poison me. Merricat, said Connie, would you like to go to sleep? Down in the boneyard 10 feet deep. I was pretending that I did not speak their language. On the moon we spoke a soft, liquid tongue, and sang in the starlight, looking down on the dead-dried world. I was almost halfway past the fence. Merricat, Merricat. Where's old Connie, home cooking dinner? Would you like a cup of tea? It was strange to be inside myself, walking steadily and rigidly past the fence, putting my feet down strongly, but without haste that they might have noticed, to be inside and know that they were looking at me. I was hiding very far inside, but I could hear them and see them still from one corner of my eye. I wished they were all lying there dead on the ground. Down in the boneyard 10 feet deep. Merricat. Once when I was going past, the Harris boys' mother came out onto the porch, perhaps to see what they were all yelling so about. She stood there for a minute watching and listening, and I stopped and looked at her, looking into her flat dull eyes, and knowing I must not speak to her and knowing I would. Can't you make them stop? I asked her that day, wondering if there was anything in this woman I could speak to, if she had ever run joyfully over grass, or had watched flowers, or known delight or love. Can't you make them stop? Kids, she said, not changing her voice or her look or her air of dull enjoyment, don't call the lady names. Yes, Ma, one of the boys said soberly. Don't go near no fence. Don't call no lady names. And I walked on, while they shrieked and shouted and the woman stood on the porch and laughed. Merricat, said Connie, would you like a cup of tea? Oh, no, said Merricat, you'll poison me. Their tongues will burn, I thought, as though they had eaten fire. Their throats will burn when the words come out, and in their bellies they will feel a torment hotter than 1,000 fires. Goodbye, Merricat, they called as I went by the end of the fence, don't hurry back. Goodbye, Merricat, give our love to Connie. Goodbye, Merricat, but I was at the Black Rock and there was the gate to our path.